everyone. I'm Nora Benavides with PEN America. We're going to get started in about a minute. I'm just letting more people filter in, but it's so great to have you all. Thanks for joining us. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Depending on where you are, it might be morning, afternoon, evening, middle of the night, maybe, but we are so thrilled to have you. My name is Nora Benavides. I'm the Director of U.S. Free Expression Programs at PEN America. I'll be facilitating most of this evening, but I just want to welcome all of you, and I want to start sharing my screen. We have so much to cover tonight, actually, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to do it. So I first want to welcome all of you, and I want to give a special shout out to our partners this evening because we have 4 amazing partners. First, Common Cause, which has been an amazing partner through our election and disinformation work. And one of our colleagues from Common Cause will be joining this evening for a section of the workshop, talking a little bit about what Common Cause is doing and how they are monitoring disinformation online. So we're really thrilled to have them. I also want to give a special shout out to our partners from the Georgia Alliance for Social Justice, to the Boston Public Library, and to the Jersey City Public Library. So librarians are often our friends, and we are so thrilled to have all of you here tonight. In terms of some very basic ground rules, I just want to point out that we have the chat function. We also have a Q&A function. And as you see from our roadmap, we will be spending time at the end of our 90 minutes together taking questions and just sort of hearing from people. So if you want to use the chat function, you can. If you want to send around resources, I know one of my colleagues, Hannah Waltz from PEN America, is also here secretly, not on video, but she'll be sharing some of our resources from PEN America throughout the presentation. And then in the Q&A, that is the place typically where you can ask things that we'll address towards the end of our workshop. We are also recording this, and it is streaming live on Facebook. I never actually mention people. All of the questions are only viewed by me, so they are anonymous, but we love doing these on Facebook Live because we have found that what we're able to do is reach an even wider swath of people. So typically, we offer these for a limited time online after the recordings, and tonight is kind of special because we've adapted our more classic media literacy workshop to really tailor it around the election. So without further ado, as you can see, here is our basic roadmap for our workshop. We're going to go through, as we always do, a little bit of what our work and our background is at PEN America, how we came to this space, why we work on disinformation and media literacy. Then we're going to get into the history of disinformation and types of misleading content that we are more likely to see. And then we're going to talk through why disinformation and other misleading content affects us all, because it does. And I want to disavow everyone of the notion that somehow experts are less possibly prey to mis and disinformation. So it affects all of us. And we want to talk a little bit about how it spreads and show you examples. And so that's where our colleagues from Common Cause will be coming in, talking a little bit about what they're doing. And then we're going to get into our media literacy toolkit. That's the place where we always try to give you the tools and equip all of you to identify misleading content and help be one of those stopgaps in preventing the spread of it. So, and then of course we reserve time for Q&A. So I want to give you a little bit of background. If you haven't attended one of our sessions before, many of them are available as recordings online from our landing page, Knowing the News, which you can check out on pen.org. But starting in 2016, PEN America typically an organization at the nexus of literature and free expression, we started researching this troubling phenomenon in which we have seen words be manipulated, ideas and language shaping public attitudes and public behavior. Really, that was what we called at the time fraudulent news or fraudulent information. And over the years, we have evolved some of the terms that we use. We now look at things in terms of disinformation and misinformation. And what we first examined in 2017 through our report called Faking News was really a 30,000-foot view of what is disinformation? What is this phenomenon? And how has the digital age helped proliferate so that misleading content reaches us faster and in ways that maybe is hard to monitor from the outside if you're not a user on Facebook or on Twitter actually looking at your feed. And then in 2019, just last year, we revisited the issue again, looking at how disinformation affected our midterm elections in 2018. And part of what we have found over the years are a few recurring issues. And part of why we are concerned about this phenomenon today and in the lead up to the 2020 election. Of course, we have seen the proliferation of foreign actors that are involved in interference and campaign tactics to somehow push false narratives. But a lot of what we've seen from Russian actors, Chinese actors, Iranian actors, are not just efforts to influence our elections, meaning who wins, who loses in any given election, but that there is also this larger, I think more insidious way that foreign interference, foreign actors have tried to undo the kind of fabric that binds us all together. And that our shared sense of knowledge, our even shared sense of what our principles are here in the United States, for example, really gets undermined by these types of false narratives promoted from foreign actors. And so the effort to undo and sort of stoke political polarization has been a recurring theme we've seen from foreign actors who set up a range of things from fake social media sites to fake accounts on social media, really to incite people and even to make it seem like certain topics are trending when it's all thanks to coordinated, inauthentic bots and other profiles online that don't exist. We've also seen domestic actors. Those are homegrown examples of mis and disinformation. And as we get into tonight's workshop, I'll be talking through some of the differences between misinformation, disinformation, and other types of misleading content. But we've absolutely seen this growth, I would say a spurt actually, of domestic actors that are potentially trying to create narratives to discredit political opponents, to otherwise here in the US, where I work and where I live and where we're now thinking about the 2020 election, that these domestic actors are really attempting to do something akin to foreign interference tactics as well. And then of course there are what I think some of the more dangerous aspects of how we are all targeted. There is something called micro-targeting, which is, I think if we weren't in the digital age, we could consider tailored messages that each of us receive something that seems par for the political course. But with micro-targeting now on platforms like Facebook, every individual and potentially small groups of us are given tailored and very carefully crafted content, political ads, given our tendencies, our behaviors, the things that we like and follow on social media. And so that kind of messaging is able to move in a very laser-like way with efficiency to reach each of us in different ways. And so in practice, what I think that means and why it's so dangerous is that I might be seeing something drastically different than what my colleagues at Common Cause are seeing. The political ads then that our colleagues at the Georgia Alliance for Social Justice, they may all be seeing very different types of ads promoting different narratives. And so when we come together to talk about, let's say, our November election or any other issue, COVID, civil unrest and the protests that we've seen over the last several months, we may not all be coming to the table with the same set of interests and frankly, even the same set of information because we're being targeted in very unique ways. And then over and over again in 2016 and 2018, we have seen day of disinformation tactics. Those are the types of things that on your phone, let's say you're standing in line waiting to vote, there may be ways that you see information crop up on your social media feed, on your Facebook or your Twitter that actually promotes some kind of disinformation, pushing to either depress voter turnout or otherwise sway voter engagement. And one of the things that I always think is so disturbing about this is I have to ask, and we've always asked over the years, is, we don't want these types of tactics to become a new normal. But I unfortunately think that if you take a look at any homepage of a news outlet, any credible news outlet right now, there will always be at least one headline on the top about disinformation. And that the things that we now have to adapt to include learning things like media literacy. And so over the years in our research, of course, one of the questions we have posed and really considered deeply with other experts is, what would solutions look like? And frankly, as an organization that still wants to promote free expression and a diversity of ideas, I don't think that we can exclusively say, let's just remove content online. Let's remove everything. Let's remove disinformation. Let's remove anything that seems troubling or micro-targeting. We can't simply abdicate that kind of control and to relinquish all of this to the social media platforms. And so as a free expression organization, one thing PEN America has come back to over and over again is the need to empower online users, to empower all of you. And so one of our core findings over and over again has been the notion that if we give citizens and others the kinds of tools like tonight to make sense of what you see online, that can help stem the spread of troubling, misleading content. And so in the lead up to the election, we are especially attentive to a range of ways that we need to triage the problem. And so here's just a very short smattering of what we're up to, because we are aggressively ramping up our election defense work and trying to defend against disinformation. But what that means is we are working with voters, like many of you tonight, trying to get you the things that will help you make sense of what you see online so that as election day comes up, and frankly, in the days and weeks following election day, you don't fall prey to misleading content. We're also working with media partners, journalists, editors, and others to think through what those tough calls are going to be in the lead up to the election. Because on election day, and even in the weeks before, there are going to be questions for journalists and for standards desk editors and others in all of your communities and at the national level to think about, well, are we going to run this headline? Are we going to run what these early results or projections look like in a given town, in a given region? Because when those types of headlines come out, we will, as readers, of course, make assumptions which can sway what our voter behavior is like. And so we're working through what the tough calls will be for our media partners. And then finally, we're working with librarians and educators because I really don't think we can do all of this alone by just leading tons of sessions. And so our librarian colleagues and allies have been really wonderful partners in actually helping to create and adapt their own workshops around this issue. And so if you hear about in your community what your local library is doing, one, I would celebrate and applaud it, and know that some of what we're working on now is trying to scale as much as we can to get as much of these resources in everyone's hands and everyone's eyes. So why are we so concerned? Well, I think let's start with what we often know intuitively to be true, that we're online more than ever. Certainly since the pandemic, we have been online way more than ever. On our laptops, on our cell phones, on our tablets. Our kids are online now more than ever because they're at home often taking lessons. Our parents, our other family members are online. Everyone is on their cell phones. But in terms of how we get our information and our news, what's been interesting is to see a pretty steady rise over the years in the way that we as adults turn to different sites. And pretty much there is this growing majority now of people who turn to social media platforms to get their news. And I want to be clear that Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Tumblr, TikTok, Instagram, those are not actually news sites. Those are pathways to news. So if one of my friends posts something on Facebook, they post an article, let's say from Fox News or from the New York Times or from the Philadelphia Inquirer, they are not actually news sites that I'm gathering information from. They're pathways. And part of what we want to begin doing is thinking about how we consume information. because we must all think carefully about, well, can I diversify where I'm getting my news? How am I checking my own bias in this? How am I checking the bias of the news sources that I am going to most naturally, maybe even passively? And so, as always, one of the things we encourage people to begin doing is to do this digital scan. Think about where you receive news and information. It might be from talk radio, it could be from social media, from the posts that your friends share, it could be other things, directly from print, actually newspaper print. I've talked with some of my friends to see who actually still gets printed newspapers. We still receive the New Yorker. So it's really interesting to think about how you're getting information. And in thinking through that, now that we're all online more than ever, I think it's really critical to have a standard definition of what we're facing right now when we think about disinformation. So let's just be clear. Disinformation, as PEN America defines it, and many other experts now, really are on board that there is a key distinction here between mis and disinformation. Disinformation is demonstrably false information that is presented as fact with the intention to deceive the public. And it's really that intent element that's so critical. Because when we think about what misinformation is simply mistaken. It is information or even news that has errors. It could be a reporting error. It could be some other error. And frankly, one of the more interesting pathways to receiving misinformation is when, let's say, you are on the receiving end as a reader of disinformation, and then you share something thinking you're helping your friends. And when you share it, you don't have any ill intent at all. And so it goes from disinformation to misinformation. But there is a whole other, I would say, typology, if you will, of what different misleading content pieces are. And we're not going to go through deeply each and every single one, but I want you to just begin thinking through, what am I seeing? Here are the different things that you might actually be seeing and you're not fully aware when you encounter, let's say, a fake news website. Maybe one of your friends has shared an article that seems credible, and if you didn't verify, you wouldn't know that if you dig deeply on some kind of news site, there really isn't any news site at all. There is a rise now in what we call these pink slime sites. Those are sites that masquerade as real and credible news, and they're not. Of course, one of the biggest categories of misleading content is stuff that proliferates on social media. And we're going to talk a little bit later on today about what that's like. But that's in private Facebook groups sometimes. People will share things. I've been monitoring some of this with colleagues of mine at other organizations, organizations like First Draft and others. And what we have found is that any number of things people can start claiming, and that might gain traction. You know, it could be that if you gargle with saline, coronavirus will actually get cured in your mouth. And it could just be one single person posting their own view on a private Facebook group. And then that post gets a lot of play and a lot of engagement. And the kind of theory or whatever the narrative is that someone has started proliferating grows and gets more and more audience. And so you want to be careful about the opinions and even just the random musings of people in social media groups and even on your feed. And then there's this other category. It's called coordinated inauthentic behavior. The platforms call it CIB, if you want to be really fancy. And that's really the kind of content that reaches us because of fake accounts. And we're going to show you what some of those look like. There are also ways that we, frankly, may sometimes click on things like clickbait or spam. The kinds of articles that I can't help but sometimes I want to click on, that often are much more in the gossip realm, but they can be pathways to take you to any number of things where you could be catfished or you could be otherwise targeted, locked out of your computer. And so you kind of want to just be careful of some of those luring headlines that might just be clickbait and spam. And then finally, I think number 5 is an interesting area. This is websites and profiles even that push highly partisan, biased information. Now, this may not necessarily be misleading content in and of itself, but it may also not be grounded in credible hallmarks of journalism, where people who are steeped in knowing how to cite to sources, cite to evidence, cite to data, that oftentimes these types of websites and news really lack all of those hallmarks. And so again, we're going to go through what the hallmarks look like. But there's a long history of disinformation. And a lot of times people will say, I feel so bad, I didn't know that I would fall prey to this. And I'm like, well, propaganda has been around for a long time. Even in early America, there were examples of political sort of mudslinging and accusations against political opponents in newspapers where rife with lies and exaggeration. There simply were no sort of standards and ethics around how to report. And so those types of newspapers reached people and they just claimed whatever the writers wanted to be able to claim or were paid to write about. And so this is a long-standing phenomenon. And one of the reasons I think I find it so dangerous now is because we're all online. And the digital age has allowed these types of pieces of content to reach us so much faster and all the time. And so what does it actually mean? Why might we be susceptible if we see something on Facebook, let's say? Well, one, I think it's our emotions. Disinformation thrives on engagement. And what that really means is, let's take an example where you see a piece of content and you see that it's been engaged with a lot. Let's say it's a news article, and almost 1 million people have either liked it, commented on it, shared it. You want to get in on the action. You want to feel like it's this groundbreaking thing, and you might even want to share it. And so not only that, but you could read a headline and it might really incite any number of emotions. It could make you furious, could make you angry, sad, scared. In the context of the pandemic, we have seen a massive growth of news that really tries in misleading ways to discredit science, to discredit leading authorities in science and health. And then often these types of headlines can really just kind of entice you and lure you in because it plays on that anxiety of none of us quite know the full story yet of what COVID-19 means, what the larger implications will be. And so people might fall prey because of those emotions. It plays into your emotions and you're not thinking carefully. You're not even slowing down to think, why am I seeing the piece of content I'm seeing? And then so often, this type of content has what we call a patina of credibility. That is the stuff that makes it feel kind of real. That thing where it's like, there's almost a kernel of truth here. So we'll show you an example how all of this plays together. Because then often, as you see so much engagement, bots and other inauthentic types of profiles can actually help push content out and make it seem more and more engaged with. And then there are two psychological reasons that I always talk about that I think part of why we are so susceptible to disinformation is the illusory truth effect, which is really the notion that the more often we see something, the more likely we are to think it's real and to think it's true. And so there have been numerous studies actually to study this, what we call almost like a brain shortcut. When we see something, we accept it. We see it again, we accept it more. And so actually in 2016, researchers did a study showing people different headlines. And in showing them, the researchers pointed out when something was false and when something was true. And then the participants were distracted and they were shown another set of headlines. Some of the second round of headlines included things from the first round. Every time they saw something from the first round, they said, oh, this is something I've seen. Yeah, that's true. And part of what they found, the researchers, is that it really didn't matter if the story from the first round had been true or false. No matter what happened, the second time participants saw these stories, they just kind of doubled down and they said, oh yeah, I've seen that, that's true. And part of it plays into our confirmation bias also. That if we see something, we actually often then like seeing what we agree with, what we believe. And part of why we are susceptible to content is when the mix of all of these elements come together, when we might be enticed in by a headline and then some kind of emotion conjures up feelings like, well, I have to get on this action, or I am furious about this. You see things that are incredibly engaging. And let's take a look at what it means in practice. Part of what we've also noted in terms of this slide is actually just that even labels from social media platforms have mixed results. Part of what we've seen is recently some leading platforms, Facebook is one of them, have tried to use things around labels or disclaimers with mixed results of being able to identify if some of these disputed by third-party labels actually help inform users and make them a little more discerning of what they're seeing. But let's look at what we're seeing now. And so I'm going to be talking through just a few things we see. And then I'm so happy I saw my colleague Jesse pop up very briefly. Jesse is finally here from Common Cause, and I'll be turning it to him in just a couple of slides. So we're thrilled to have him here today. So let's kind of start by just taking a scan of what we're seeing now. First of all, we are seeing, I think, just this unbelievable rise in disinformation and a lot of sort of compounding ways that it's reaching us. We're seeing pandemic-related disinformation, which many people call the infodemic. Back in February, the World Health Organization said that this was an infodemic of unseen proportions, that the way we were as online users, all of us being targeted with fake and misleading content, was on the rise. We've also, over the past summer, where we've seen a rise in George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests, also seen disinformation around the protests themselves. I'll show you some examples in a little bit of how fake accounts have tried to lure people to protests that actually don't exist. There have been other ways that vulnerable populations have been targeted with harassment. And so there is this rise in protest-related disinformation. And then, of course, we are already seeing election-related mis and disinformation, seeing things such as individuals who are told that different parties vote on different days. We'll go through some of those examples. But let's just take 1 minute to talk through really the flow of and the production around how disinformation gets created and then how it reaches us. And this is an example from 2016. This was an article in which the headline said that the Pope endorsed Donald Trump for president. This was, I think, one of the most engaged with election-related posts on Facebook in 2016. It was conceived of by someone that we are not aware of, but it was published then on an actual news site, which was one of those fake news websites that I mentioned before. And so someone wrote it, but what's really interesting is it started with that kernel of truth, like I mentioned. And so what that means is there was a real interview with the Pope talking about the United States 2016 election. And in that interview, he mentioned both of the presidential candidates. He mentioned Donald Trump and he mentioned Hillary Clinton. But it was a completely different interview. The subject was about Hillary Clinton and about her emails. It was a very different context. But he mentioned both of their names, and the words that he had actually been quoted with were spliced together to create some of the quotes that were used in this news article. And so when it came out then, a few things happened. First, it was distributed, of course, by the news site, the fake news site. And it was pushed out, among other things, on Facebook by people who were working for the fake news website. And then it reached other people, right? It reached, let's say, other people working for that site. It then reached people like you and me. And it's part of sort of that long shelf life of how disinformation moves, that maybe it starts as disinformation. But when you or I share it, and we think we're sharing it by, let's say, to be able to inform our colleagues, it turns into misinformation. And as we think about our own role in this 2020 election, I actually always try to encourage people to think of themselves as creators of content, publishers almost in a way. If you think about how when you post something on Facebook or Twitter, you're publishing, you're putting something out there for other people to consume. And so you want to be able to take control of that experience and do everything you can, your utmost, to be the stopgap so that others don't fall prey to misleading content. So what are we seeing now? Here are a few things we are already starting to see. We are seeing claims that you might get COVID at a mailbox if and when you mail in your ballot. That has been debunked by scientists. We are also seeing claims now from my colleagues at First Draft that mail-in ballots might be color-coded to out voters and their party affiliation. This is something that proliferated on Facebook private group messages, and the notion here is people who receive those mail-in ballots, there are different colors on the top, but every county counts and deals with tabulation very differently from every other county. So debunking this is really hard because what someone does in Los Angeles in the local board of elections might be different from the tabulation process in Alabama, different from Atlanta, Georgia. different from Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And so being able to sift through that people might be digesting that content and then believing it in drastically different places is really hard. And as I mentioned before, we're also seeing things that Democrats and Republicans vote on different days, which they do not. Everyone votes on November 3rd. And then finally, in terms of those election day types of narratives, there are other claims that I've seen every year, 2016 and 2018, that Spanish language voters cannot bring a translator into the ballot box. And this is honestly just absolutely fake. That is not correct. And voters who do speak Spanish can bring a translator into the ballot box. They have the right to do that. So this is just a very short smattering of what we are seeing. What I'm now going to do is turn it over to my colleague from Common Cause. I think, oh good, Jesse is here. Jesse, thank you. We welcome you, and please take it away.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. I think you're going to have to control the slides for me unless we switch, but I think we'll make it work. So Common Cause is a national nonpartisan organization that works to uphold the fundamental values of American democracy. We work to make sure that we have a democracy that works for everyone, and we're always working to ensure, among other things, that eligible voters have the right and the opportunity to vote. For the last 2 decades, we've been working with the Election Protection Coalition, which is the nation's largest nonpartisan election protection coalition. It's co-led by Common Cause, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and State Voices. And one of the key activities that Common Cause has been engaged in that has become of utmost importance over the last couple of election cycles has been combating cyber suppression. Cyber suppression is really this nexus of online harassment and hate speech that exists online and voter suppression. The vote suppression that we've seen historically offline is now being targeted online, and it's often targeted at the same communities that have been challenged by voter suppression in the past. So communities of color, immigrant communities. The example that Nora just shared about Spanish language translators is a great example that's targeted directly towards Spanish-speaking communities. People with disabilities, who many times vote by mail is the only way that they can cast a secure ballot. Women, other historically marginalized groups, also students, young people, and first-time voters. A recent poll by NPR showed that over half of people 18 to 35 didn't have the information they needed to successfully cast a mail-in ballot. And other polling has showed that Black Americans and Latinx Americans are much more likely to not have the correct voter identification information they need, or to know how how to find where their polling place is, or other information related to voting. Disinformation used by vote suppressors compounds these problems and are used, and these challenges that already exist are amplified by bad actors who use online disinformation to suppress the vote. Go forward. Our research and our advocacy starting in 2016 and as well as in the midterms in 2018 and now in every primary here in 2020 has identified 4 key cyber suppression threats. The first is what we would call the time, place, or manner of elections. And this is the kind of classic vote suppression that folks may be more aware of in an offline context. We have seen in the past billboards that tell communities of color the wrong voting information, intimidation, like making a false claim that there will be law enforcement at the polling place or ICE will be at the polling places, robocalls, the things that tell people the incorrect information about how to vote, that if that was followed, they would be disenfranchised. This is prevalent online, and despite it being a clear violation of the terms of service of Twitter, Facebook, and many other social media platforms, we still find it in every primary, and we are confident, given the trend that we have seen in identifying and combating disinformation, it will accelerate in October when early voting really hits its stride, as well as in November. The thing about this kind of disinformation is, for many experienced voters, it is easy to discount the impact of it. Many of us on this call are experienced voters and know there's one day to vote for every party, and there's one day to vote no matter what age you are. But in today's coronavirus pandemic culture, moment that we're in, there are senior hours at the grocery store. So why wouldn't there potentially be a different way to have some groups of people vote because we're experiencing social distancing? So this kind of time, place, and manner disinformation is unfortunately much more believable and has a greater impact today than it ever has in any election cycle previously, because the changes to our election process have literally changed the time, place, and manner of elections, and we're doing things a little bit differently in 2020. So it's important to be completely on guard and aware of this kind of disinformation, which is easy for some folks to discount. It may not be, it's still a challenge for many, many voters. The second kind of threat that we have seen is the false narrative and conspiracy theories. And there are some very popular Twitter accounts that folks on this call no doubt are aware of that are run by some very powerful elected officials that continue to push many of these narratives. So claiming that the elections will be rigged if there's mail-in balloting options extended to Americans. That is a completely false narrative. That is untrue. No, there is clear that there is no widespread voter fraud that exists in any kind of voting, in person or mail-in balloting. But these narratives continue to be pushed by partisan activists in order to suppress the vote and make it more challenging and make it more unlikely that voters will take up these alternative and expanded voting processes, and sets the stage for them to potentially dispute the results of an election if it doesn't go their way. Unfortunately, many of these false narratives and conspiracy theories are not in violation of the terms of service of Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms, because they're framed as either opinion or reportage, which is not necessarily factual, but is unlikely to be removed always from the platforms. Twitter recently came out with some stronger recommendations this morning, which is a step in the right direction, but it is still clear that this is a challenge that voters will have to navigate. Even if we found all of these narratives, the platforms wouldn't necessarily take them down. And then the last two narratives here are important threats as well. One is a narrative that depresses turnout. So in 2016, the Russian-affiliated Internet Research Agency created fake Facebook accounts, one that was called The Blacktivist that was targeted at African Americans. And while for weeks and months it pushed Black activism and content about engagement, on the last few days it turned to a vote boycott campaign, and it said there's no difference in the candidates and no one should bother voting. So these narratives we know will exist, and there will be pushes by trolls and activists, foreign and bad actors, foreign and domestic, to try and depress the turnout, as well as just negative campaigning against every candidate. And then the last one is intimidation of elections officials, which we unfortunately have seen through the doxing, which is the lingo of releasing someone's personal information online in an attempt to intimidate them. And unfortunately, this has happened with elections officials in an attempt to intimidate them from doing their job. So these are the four key narratives that we are focused on. You can go forward. Now, here's some just very quick examples, and I think you can go ahead and just move through these as I speak, because while we've seen these, the key point is that these appear across multiple different platforms. So you can just keep going through these. And our ability of finding these and doing something about them relies on our ability of identifying them and communicating either with the platforms to remove them or be able to provide a defense to voters, either in the form of counter speech that helps give people the correct information, or inoculates them against disinformation before it arrives. One thing that I'll note is on these, and this new one is an example of Nextdoor, which is another platform that we're seeing disinformation appear on, which is beyond your typical Facebook and Twitter. Now, one of the biggest challenges of combating disinformation is not amplifying that disinformation, because we all have an instinct to tell people, this is wrong, don't believe it. But because the way that the social media platforms algorithms work, all that does is it tells the algorithm that this is engaging content. So here's a great example, and another example of how sometimes disinformation isn't necessarily intended to cause harm. We've seen a number of examples of narratives that are false. A great example is a meme that's going around Facebook right now that talks about the need to add multiple stamps to your absentee ballot return envelope. This is not true in every state. And in fact, it's not necessary in many states. And it creates the impression that if you cannot find 2 stamps to add to your absentee ballot, you shouldn't return it. That is a very dangerous narrative to be promoting when there are many people who don't have access to stamps, either because they don't want to go to the bank or to the post office and expose themselves in our current health pandemic, or they don't have the financial resources because usually you have to buy a book of stamps instead of just 2, or they've never needed a stamp because all their banking is online. They use Venmo and PayPal to Cash App to pay vendors and to spend money, and this is a barrier to entry. So despite the fact that this has been debunked and it's not true, we're seeing many people continue to spread this narrative. My sense is it is a combination of bad actors, but mostly it's people who are trying to be helpful and saying, just in case, just in case you didn't know, this is something you should be aware of. That's an example of how disinformation can be amplified by just sharing what you think is positive or helpful, despite the fact that it's not true. It can end up creating a major problem for voters. So the cardinal rule of disinformation, and this is a great example, not sure if this is true or not, but how could it hurt, right? Adding a stamp to your ballot will help it. Well, it's actually it's not helpful because it creates an impression that it's necessary. So the fact that this is so prevalent is one example to let folks know that the key thing about disinformation is to make sure you don't amplify it. Even if you were to give the thumbs down or to reply to a post and say this isn't true, that would actually tell Facebook or Twitter that this is engaging content. So we don't want folks to do that. Here's an alternative. Part of it is there's our plan about identifying and combating disinformation. We have to address what I call the iceberg problem. Much of social media is private group content. So most Facebook groups are private. Most Facebook posts are done between friends. WhatsApp is a private chat system. Nextdoor requires you to be in that neighborhood to see that content. So while we can see a lot of this disinformation, like most tweets on Twitter are public, I think of them like the iceberg and the portion of the iceberg that's above the surface of the water. But that's actually a minority of the overall pool of dangerous, damaging disinformation that is out there. So we need to figure out, and what we were challenged was figuring out how to see below the waterline and to see the whole of the iceberg. So this is what Common Cause has been focused on in this election cycle, is solving this problem. And we've done it in the following way. So you can go ahead and move one forward. We've got 2 key aspects of our monitoring program. We have smart social listening by experts that have the big data capacities. They can aggregate huge chunks of data, the Twitter fire hose, public Facebook posts. They are able to analyze and take that data and be able to search within it with complicated Boolean keyword searches and other tools to identify, based on a set of likely keywords, disinformation. But that only gets us part of it. And so we have a human crowdsourced network of social listening volunteers. And these are the folks who have real profiles and are active in these communities, especially the ones that are being attacked with disinformation. And they're the ones who can see this. So we combine these, if you move forward, these 2 together. And this is how we solve our iceberg problem, which is at the top of the iceberg, we are able to engage our big data partners. And then below the iceberg, we're able to use our crowdsourced network in order to get transparency into that. And here's what we've accomplished so far. So we're still really in the building phase, but I'm proud of what we've been able to do with this combination of capacities. So we've already engaged over 500 volunteers. They're not just Common Cause members, but they're coming from communities in other, working with other civic engagement and voter protection groups in different communities as well. And we're continuing to expand that. And so we're building out this network of crowdsourced social media listening volunteers. We've already identified 1,000 pieces of disinformation, and of those, we've removed over 200 pieces of disinformation content from the platforms. And that's a reflection of the fact that some of this content is still not in violation of the terms of service of the platforms, which we are advocating for change. But even if they're not able to take it down, we're able to create counter speech that helps debunk and provides voters the right information. And then knowing what we know now, we're able to go to communities that may not have received that disinformation and provide them with some inoculation opportunities so that people will be, in a sense, immune to it if it comes to them. For example, we know disinformation that is in English eventually will migrate into Spanish and be a vector of attack in the Spanish language community. So we're translating our English language inoculation content into Spanish and working with those communities. So with that, we are ready and prepped to scale up for the October and November wave of disinformation. Already we're seeing kind of a hockey stick style graph that is going very quickly up and to the right in the terms of the amount of disinformation. We're seeing many of the things that have already been mentioned on this call. And in some degrees, we think the primaries were really just a sandbox for bad actors because not a lot is at stake for partisan bad actors in a primary election because it's a contest between parties. The general election is a whole different ballgame. We know that there will be challenges throughout. There's already challenges around mail-in balloting and all the way through election day and then after, where there will absolutely be a period of potential contesting of different elections, not just the presidential election, but potentially down ballot as well. And we need to prepare voters and have a rapid response capacity ready to identify and help voters when they see disinformation after the election as well. Folks are absolutely encouraged to join and engage. My email's on this slide. We also have a disinformation tip line at the Common Cause website. Hopefully PEN America will soon have one as well, where you can submit disinformation that will then be reviewed by disinformation experts, and that'll help build our database and our ability of both taking down actionable content, but also building the evidentiary record of the problems that voters face on social media through disinformation, which then sets the stage for reform with the platforms. I'm going to pause there. Thank you very much for having me.
Jesse, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And Jesse has paid me no money to say that I think Common Cause's work in this area is amazing. Before I even came to PEN America, Jesse doesn't know this, I used to volunteer every election season with election protection. And it is an amazing organization, sort of this group that's been created with a number of other organizations supporting it. So I just have to say that from a nearby and adjacent organization and ally, that the work they're doing is really amazing. So if you want to become one of those volunteers, I kind of want to. Thank you, Jesse, for showing up. And we begged Jesse to come and he said, of course I will. So we are really thrilled to have had you. And for time, I'm going to keep us moving at a clipped pace, but we are really excited to kind of move into this phase of thinking through what we actually can do. And one of the pieces, I guess, is very clearly get engaged with Common Cause. But I also think that there are some individual practices that we can think about, that each of us can become more discerning and really take control of what we're seeing online. And I think that begins with that initial question of, what am I doing when I go online? Where am I going? And how am I getting information? Are you getting it from Twitter? Are you getting it from Facebook? I think each of us can naturally just be rather passive in how we think of what we're doing because we're not thinking about it. We open up Facebook, right, on our phones, and now when we're lying in bed getting ready to fall asleep, we open it all the time. And we're not really in a posture where we're thinking, how do I curate what I'm looking at? How do I become a little more thoughtful about what I'm seeing and maybe what I'm not seeing? And so that's always our first recommendation. And then our second, in what we often call our media literacy toolkit, is to question what you're seeing. And that really involves wondering why you actually might be given a certain piece of content. The other question to then ask in this space is, well, am I seeing something a friend has posted? And is it their comment or is it something else? Is it a news article posting or a link to some kind of article? Is it an image or a video? And there are different ways that as we move through our toolkit, understanding what you're seeing and then knowing your reactions to it will help. And remember that gut instinct feeling that we started talking about earlier, that, you know, disinformation will play on our emotions, and we don't want it to do that. We want to be able to be in that posture of being empowered and knowing what we're seeing and how we're feeling. So I myself have fallen prey to this. I sometimes will see images and videos. I know that's, for me, one of the areas that I have to be really careful about, because I'll see images or videos and I'll find them evocative or moving or angering, something, and I'll really want to do something. Usually I'll want to share something that I see, but I've tried to learn to practice this step of taking that step back and then questioning what you see, because it really can be the difference between taking the bait or not. And in thinking about why you might be seeing something, a great question to ask is, well, am I seeing news or opinion? If you're seeing a news headline that's based on investigative reporting, on data, on sourcing, on other things that are really those hallmarks of credible journalism, that's one thing. But you might also just be seeing punditry, and there is a lot of it. I am guilty of that. I'll just be pontificating on Twitter. And I welcome you to comment on that. I think all of us have a First Amendment right to do it for sure. And as a lawyer that loves and defends the First Amendment, I think that that's critical. But I also think it's important to just take all of it with a grain of salt and to know that what you might be seeing is really going to affect you differently. And if what you're seeing is opinion, take that in differently than how you might actually take in news. So what do you do in the moment before you share? That's the moment I want to reach you at. I want to be that little voice now, or maybe me and Jesse, we can be those little voices right before you would share. And so there are a few things you can start thinking about doing. One is check the credibility of the source. Denver Guardian, that's an example. It may seem like a really credible news site, but it isn't. Here's an example, actually a real fake news site, the Denver City Wire, for example, that looked absolutely legitimate. There were several news articles, and when you click on them, though, they were these pink slime sites that take you to short articles, not grounded in anything, not with external links to other sources or interviews with other experts. And it was simply a bogus website that purported to be real, credible news. So you want to make sure that part of what you're able to do is sift through what are some of these hallmarks of credible journalism. Now, let's see. I'm so sorry I clicked on something by mistake. I'm so sorry about that. Let's see. I will start sharing again. Let's see. I am so sorry. I've never had this happen, but here we go. And I apologize, but I want you to make sure that you don't get derailed, unlike me, and that we are still careful to think through what we do in that step before we share. So of course, right, we want to be carefully, I have totally lost my slide deck. I've never done this before, and I am so sorry. Let's see, hold on one second. I've lost everything. In that moment, there's another thing that I think is really critical for us to do, is make sure that we are verifying the types of content that we are seeing. That can be a few different things. It can be things like social media accounts. It could also be images, videos, or other things. So if one, you're checking the credibility of a source, the next is to consider not just the credibility of that news site, but other types of credibility. And so I'm finally getting our slide deck now, which is great. And so here are, I am so sorry. Here are some of those hallmarks to watch for when you're thinking about what to look for and how not to fall prey to some of those fake news or pink slime sites. You might want to think about, for example, the ethics, the quality, and the standards around credible journalism versus other things. And so a few key takeaways are, think about what the level of citing is to sources, what kinds of correction policies your news sites have, what kind of fact checking or even thoroughness in their reporting is there. The example from the Denver City Wire was really great, and I'm not going to click back, but it was great because of one thing. When you click on those stories, they take you to tiny couple of paragraph blurbs on something that don't seem to really be thorough, certainly not citing to anything else. And so there really is just sort of this very shallow level of reporting. And that type of lack of thoroughness can be one of the signals to you that what you're looking at might not be credible. In the lead up to the election as well, we are seeing a rise in these kinds of pink slime sites, sites that are masquerading as credible and are really just sort of the pet interests of anyone, because you can slap a masthead on a website, put a couple of links there, and make it seem credible. And so if what you're trying to do is think through, well, what am I seeing? Is it news or opinion? There's this other layer of, it might also not be credible altogether. It might not be any of the above. And so in thinking through what to do before you share, I always impress upon people to verify everything. Part of what you can do in your first step is to run something through a search engine. This is a very, very low level type of step. It's one of the first things that I recommend usually in thinking about how to take control of your digital experience. So let's say you have a headline that you want to run through and see if it's credible, is it real, has it maybe been debunked somewhere? So let's take this one. Man tries to trade kidnapped baby for 15 Big Macs at Arkansas McDonald's. This was an absolutely fake article. And some of my colleagues have seen this article, among others, and confirmed that Now 8 News is a place that doesn't provide credible journalism, that has been now fact-checked on various websites and isn't real. But what you could do is one of two things. You could run the headline itself through Google, literally copy and paste some of those key terms. And you can also do some lateral reading through what your search results come up with by looking up the news outlet, looking up Now 8 News. And what you'll find sometimes is that fact-checking websites will already have done the work for you. If you're not getting anything, frankly, sometimes these types of things can conjure up more misinformation or disinformation. And so you want to be careful. And I have to say that if you're really becoming steeped in media literacy tools, something to be cautious about is how much time this can really take. And that if you're committed to verifying the credibility and the veracity of what you're seeing, it can take time. The other thing that'll take time is tracking down what the origins of images and videos are. I share this image every time I do these workshops because I have to say it's my favorite, and I'm always willing to admit when I have been a victim of misleading content, because I find them often the most evocative examples. But here you have an image from a story that proliferated and images of animals around COVID. And that while people were, practicing lockdown measures and other public safety guidelines, not going outside, news during March and April started proliferating that actually animals were thriving. And the silver lining to the pandemic was that while humans are away, animals are doing great. And that's wonderful for the environment. And so I saw this image. I think it's beautiful, right? I was probably sad and desperate, wanting to travel. And I saw it and I thought it conjured a lot of emotions for me. And I said, I want to share this with everyone. And I thought about a few things. I thought about, why am I so emotional? What are the origins of this? Can I confirm it? Because this was a post that I saw on Instagram that had been engaged with so much. And so it goes back to that flow chart, if you will, and the lifespan of how disinformation works, why we're so susceptible to it. And so I thought through and finally tracked down that in the end, swans are always swimming in the Venice canals. And that even if this was not proliferating because of ill intent, this is an example where a miscaptioned photograph, a miscaptioned image can lead you to think certain things, sometimes incredibly false and misleading types of conclusions. So what are some real examples of this? On the right, you'll see, this is a real colleague of mine who works with Black Lives Matter. And in Atlanta, she and other organizers this summer saw that there were emails being sent from an email account called blm@gmail.com. That email was telling people to come out to protests that were not happening. And so people took what they were receiving in those emails as somehow credible, when in fact they had received something out of the blue and they didn't know who that account was from. And so one of the efforts that my colleague here, Tiffany, tried to do was really implement just pushing people and pointing them in the direction of credible information. You could almost consider this an antidote when we think of flooding the zone. That while certainly we are seeing in the lead up to the election a flooding the zone of disinformation, let's all be sources that flood the zone with credible information. And that is exactly what she was trying to do. She was calling out by not sharing a piece of misinformation, but really pointing people to more credible accounts. Now, on the left, you'll see this example from supposedly Rashida Tlaib. She's a member of Congress, and this is an example where this is a fake account. The L in her last name is a capital I. And this is one of those examples where if you're thinking through what to verify, if you feel strongly about the Venice canals and the swans, you want to consider why. If you suddenly see an email and you don't know who it is, if you again have some kind of emotion around it, or you don't know why you're receiving it and want to think more critically, if you're on Twitter and you are shocked by this thing that Rashida Tlaib has said, you'll note that her account does not have the blue check mark. And it really is one of those horrible fake accounts trying to masquerade as credible or real, impersonating someone. And we're going to see more and more examples of these types of things in the lead up to the election. But in thinking through what those examples were, such as claims that you can get COVID while you are engaging in voting, or if you are mailing in your ballot, some of the things that Jesse pointed out that they are already seeing about the time, place, and manner of voting, or even around things like these false narratives, it can be incredibly hard to debunk. It can also be something that we're all susceptible to. And part of what happens is in the lead up to the election, there is a kind of fervor, almost a frenzy, where people want to just share content out, right? And what we've put together at PEN America is a new guide on what to do if your friends and family share misinformation. It is, I have to say, the #1 question we get in every training we do. And so we finally listened to all of you and we said, we have to think through what are the ways that all of us can help be a better resource for others. So here are some of what our recommendations are now, and I think it's worth going through just a little bit. One is try to verify. Let's say you're on Facebook and you see that your family member has shared something or a friend has shared what you think is disinformation. Well, one, you want to make sure that the content is actually misleading or false. Because one of the worst things you could do is potentially comment publicly and draw a lot of engagement to the post, and it's actually not fake information at all. And so you want to go through some of the process that we just laid out of trying to find out, well, can I fact check this? Can I verify the origins of an image or a video? Can I do my homework? And then you want to think about if you comment and how you're going to engage with someone. And I am very glad that Jesse brought up this question of ways that we deal with or address disinformation. Generally, experts try to avoid and encourage you to stay away from publicly commenting. So often that only does one thing, which is boosts engagement on a post. The social media algorithms will see that a comment somehow means it's more liked or it's more engaged with, and it'll just boost the visibility in other people's feeds. And so you want to be very careful about publicly commenting. There may be instances, and I always want to be careful to say there is no surefire secret recipe or formula to this, but there may be instances if you see so many people commenting on a post, fighting over it, if you've already gone the extra mile of verifying and going to fact-checking websites to see if something is misleading, and you want to share those resources, that could be useful. But generally, especially if someone has just posted something, I always try to suggest that what you do is not publicly comment. And instead, you provide some kind of private message to the person that posted it. And when you do that, you want to consider their perspective. You want to consider how easy it can be to feel any level of embarrassment or shame or anger when someone calls you out. This happened to me years ago. I shared a piece of, I guess, fake news, and a friend of mine called me out on Facebook, and I was mortified. And so part of what you want to do is bring a level of empathy to what you're doing and how you're talking about the fact that you found out the content they shared is not correct, is misleading, is disinformation, whatever. And maybe that will go well, and that'll be really great. You can share the fact-checking resources that you have used. It's fantastic. Sometimes these types of conversations do not go well. And no matter what you do, some people will not agree with you or accept what you're saying or see reason. If you do this in the most nonpartisan, rational, thoughtful, empathetic ways, there may still be instances in which you need to kind of figure out your exit strategy. And that's part of why we always suggest try to avoid escalating things. If it seems like it isn't going well, share your resources and get out of Dodge. And then finally, I think there's something really important here about how to be a resource for others. In the lead up to the election, I am absolutely committed, and I think all of us should be committed to sharing credible information. If you cannot take time to verify what you want to share, think about whether you share it at all. If I, Nora, cannot take the time to confirm that a video of a polling location that I am standing in supposedly on election day is too long, if I can't confirm that that is actually my polling location, I am not going to retweet that video. And in that sense, you again are really in control. You're in the driver's seat here and able to decide what content other people that follow you are going to see. And in being a resource, in thinking through what you see, you also can proactively share things. So here are some of the best fact-checking resources that we've pulled together and that I always cite to. PolitiFact, which is by Pointer, is a wonderful website. And part of what they do is they have sort of a ranking on a long spectrum of how content can be a lie or ranging from less of a lie. And their worst category is what they call liar, liar, pants on fire. So I would encourage you to check it out. It's a lot of fun. Here's sort of just a little image to give you a sense of ways that they have this scale, this rate meter, if you will. And they have a whole list of statements that they say are pants on fire. Another really great one is the Washington Post. They have a fact checker. They also have this wonderful visual cue of Pinocchio, and that the greater the level of the lie or the misleading content, the more Pinocchios there are. So I would encourage you to check these out. In the email that we send to you all after this workshop, we're going to be providing links to all of these pieces of resources. So I don't want you to feel like you don't have access or you might forget them, because we are absolutely going to share. Now, we only have about 20 minutes, and I want to kind of round out some of the more proactive and really just practical things that all of us can do in the lead up to November 3rd, and frankly, even thinking about after Election Day. A lot of what we're already seeing are issues around mail-in ballots, of course, and we know that the electoral process is being discredited from all sides by these disinformation tactics seeking to undermine trust in the process. And so part of what we're trying to do at PEN America is help just let everyone know what expectations should be in the lead up and following Election Day. And so I think one of the first things you can do is learn about the threat of disinformation on our election. And you're already doing a good job, I would say a pretty good job, because you're attending this workshop. There are other ways that we encourage you to check out our resources and to think about identifying who your trusted voices are in your communities. That means identifying Who is it that's really pushing out credible content? Is it a local news reporter? Is it a talk radio host or another radio host of some sort in your community? Is it some local influencer that you know of who owns a shop nearby? Identify those people. Try to do the research in advance. And if you don't find those people, think about what resources you can share with your friends and your family. We have a whole set of resources in our media literacy lab that we will be sharing after tonight. And as you know, Common Cause has connected you to some of what their resources are and their training program. And then for election day and afterwards, first of all, election disinformation is really, really tricky because not only does it require you to confirm that something is not credible, that is maybe misleading, but if you want to go the extra mile of actually voting and engaging in the electoral process, there's something else you have to do, which is you have to go an extra mile of finding the actual correct information. If you hear that your polling location is closed, you have to go the extra mile of confirming if it is in fact closed. And that's part of what organizations and entities like Election Protection provide. They are a wonderful resource that you can call up. They have affiliates and hotlines in every state for voters who say, I don't know if my polling location is closed, I heard it was. And so they're a great resource. PEN America is a great resource. We have so many people that are working throughout all of election season to lay out what we should be expecting. And then research your local and state board of elections and think about what will we anticipate after election day. The vote tabulation process will take time. And ranging from the highest level with our presidential race to local races, the results may trickle in at different times. And the fact that there are days potentially in which we do not know results doesn't necessarily mean that the process is flawed or even that we should be discrediting and not believing what we're hearing. It really just means that we have to be very careful about what information and news we are consuming. And so in the days after the election, I am now referring to things as election week, even election month, where you might very well see results and coverage of results, and you'll need to really be careful to figure out, is this real? Can I confirm this? Can I go to my local or state board of elections websites? Can I go to my Secretary of State's website? Could I maybe go to the AP because the AP is involved in calling our national race? These are the types of things that you'll want to begin thinking about. And over the next 50 plus days, PEN America will be doing more of these workshops, diving very deeply into these areas of what you can do in your communities. So I want to save time for some questions. We had to really blaze through all of this, but I just want to flag three things. One, I hope you will stay in touch with us. Please stay in touch with PEN America. This is our social media. You can also expect some resources from us after the training. That will be coming from our media literacy email. And then when you close out of this in about 15 minutes, you're going to be prompted with a post-workshop survey. And I hope that you will fill it out. These are anonymous and we do not publicize the names of anyone. These types of survey and testimonial results really help PEN America in shaping, adapting, tailoring the workshops that we provide. And so we'll be doing more of these. One type of session will be sessions where journalists and community members come together in communities all over the country so that all of you and voters can learn, where do I turn for credible information? We're also going to continue doing listening sessions, conversations where communities and voters can talk about what they're worried about, where they're turning. And then we're doing more of these trainings, like the hard-hitting stuff on what media literacy is, how you can use media literacy tools to be able to identify misleading content and hopefully go through how to not share it, how to verify and fact check what you're seeing so that you help prevent the spread of it. And in doing that, we're going to be offering some of these, I will say, in English as well as in Spanish. So I want to open it up for questions. I would point all of you to the Q&A function instead of the chat function, and I will be taking these anonymously. So just so you know. So the first question that I have is Isn't the problem here a tragic collapse of critical thinking with large segments of the population? You can find numerous sites on the web that validate and confirm your own biases. I think that's a wonderful question. Absolutely, that is one problem. I would say that there are a number of compounding problems if we think of why we are in the situation that we are in, why content online is insidious and can influence us. And part of what we are trying to do with these media literacy trainings is help build back up, not just critical thinking, but the kinds of everyday, very simple practices. And so if you're scrolling on your social media feed, yeah, be critical. That's great. Have critical thinking. But you also want to be able then to really implement things like questioning if what you're seeing is making you feel emotional in a certain way, question if what you're seeing is news or opinion, and then diversifying your news sources. And so the fact that you've asked about ways that what we see just confirm what we already see or believe and our own bias, I think that's a wonderful point. And absolutely, many of us can be guilty of that. But we have to simply push back now on that and be able to think through, well, what is my digital experience and how can I maybe adapt it to take better control over what I'm doing? Another question is, often bad actors will get kicked off of one platform and then move on to another. Do you think that their behavior on one platform should impact their ability to join and post on another platform? Excellent question. A little different from how we're thinking about media literacy and the way that each of us can potentially be empowered to really curate what we're doing and what we're sharing or not sharing. That being said, I think this is fantastic in terms of really the future of speech online. And as a free expression organization, I would say that PEN America is very cautious about creating blanket and unilateral rules for engagement across all platforms. I think that there are some policies that the platforms should be and slowly might be implementing to try to hold accountable bad actors. Certainly purveyors of disinformation, the kinds of actors that are aggressively and with ill intent pushing problematic, misleading, or harmful content, those types of actors need to be escalated. And we are seeing some really interesting coordination, just a little tiny bit between the platforms on this front. And so Facebook and Twitter have started collaborating a little bit in the lead up to the election in escalating the really bad instances of disinformation that they are seeing. And as that continues, I hope that they will actually collaborate more, because those types of crisis situations require more than simply each platform thinking through what its own escalation process looks like. Another question: do any laws protect against voter disinformation? I would think this would be illegal in the offline world. I know the Federal Elections Commission is concerned mainly with illegal fundraising, but should this fall under their jurisdiction or another federal regulator? One, I'm loving how sophisticated these questions are, and no one's asking about what to do when someone shares misinformation. So I'm hoping that means that our tip sheet and our guide on that is catching on. Within the legal realm, when we're thinking about disinformation, from the outset, I will point out that I myself, a couple of years ago, mistakenly thought that statutes that criminalize purveyors of disinformation might intuitively be good. That means that I thought, as a lawyer, if we are trying to impose sanctions on people that post fake and misleading content, disinformation, that could help crack down on that kind of speech. The problem is that often these kinds of criminal statutes, just so you all are aware, can be vehicles to silence legitimate speech. And in the international context, PEN America has been researching these examples, ranging from places like Singapore to Morocco. Brazil is now considering a fake news statute. And unfortunately, it's most often political dissidents and journalists that are targeted with those statutes. Here in the United States, we are challenging right now through litigation a case in Puerto Rico where a fake news statute was introduced and passed, mainly to target anyone who shares false information about public emergencies. It was inspired by COVID. And that's a situation where, again, journalists have been under attack and under fire for their reporting, trying to essentially give the public information about the crisis. So from the outset, I would say laws generally that might protect against disinformation often have a double-edged sword in the way that they are applied. In terms of voter disinformation, you are correct that the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, is concerned mostly with the fundraising and then with sort of the tabulation and post-election day process. But part of what we're thinking through and with other partners is, what are the other potential policy solutions? What are the ways that we could potentially try to push for legislation that mandates implementing media literacy curriculum in schools all across the United States, even in one state? Also thinking about what are the ways that we find other proactive solutions to counter voter disinformation. And so we are incredibly careful in sort of thinking through what the unintended consequences are here from a regulatory perspective. Someone has asked, how do you do a reverse image search? And so that's a great question, and we provide some details in our various guides that we'll be sending you about this. So a very quick and dirty version is you can do this through a number of ways. One is through Google reverse image search. You can also do it with various plugins, and this gets kind of technical pretty fast. And for the sake of time, what I want to do is be able to actually just share our directions in the email that we send following the training. Someone has asked, do you think Snopes is a good verifying source? I use this for friends. Do you have any other all-purpose sites? And I would say that, Snopes has been around since the 90s. And I actually think Snopes provides pretty credible and very thoughtful fact-checking. But in the spirit of our media literacy sort of recommendations around diversifying your consumption, I would also encourage you to check out factcheck.org. I would encourage you to check out the Washington Post fact checker. I would also encourage you to check out things like PolitiFact. PolitiFact, remember, if you think back to their rate-o-meter that they have, Pants on Fire being the most egregious example of misleading content. And so I absolutely think you need to use a number of fact-checking resources. And again, we will be sharing those in the email that we send after the training today. Someone else has asked, are you developing a list of libraries and their programs and list of contacts? We are not developing a list of libraries necessarily, but I will say two things. We are working with a number of library associations and doing several train the trainer programs in the lead up to the election with librarians. And as you may recall, some of our partners today were libraries. So the Boston Public Library and the Jersey City Public Library. Libraries have been doing a fantastic job of getting in touch with us. We are tailoring some of our resources for them so that they can appropriate and adapt what we do here for whatever purposes they want, whatever length or depth they want to provide their constituents. The ALA also has a really great resource on voter engagement in libraries. And it's a fantastic, very short guide on what libraries can do, how librarians can come up with their own types of programming. And the ALA's very new guide is another resource that we'll be sharing when we send out our post-workshop email. Someone else has asked, how would you start these kinds of conversations with teenagers? Well, first, there are a few resources and other organizations that we work with that I would just highlight. One is the News Literacy Project, which educates educators to teach news literacy in middle and high schools. And they have some really great resources, the News Literacy Project, on their website. Some of it's public facing. But in a much deeper, sort of more thoughtful way, when you think about how to have these conversations with teenagers, every generation is different. How your child, your niece or your nephew, even just maybe a mentee or just a teenager that you know, the way they might come to this is very different because the way we each generationally consume information differs. And teenagers, always on TikTok, always on Instagram, can maybe have shorter attention spans. And so part of what I try to do in my conversations with young people I work a lot with first-time voters, and at Penn America, we are working right now on adapting some of our resources for first-time and young voters, is we want to make things really digestible. Really just introduce concepts like, what is disinformation? What is misinformation? How could, as teenagers, people be really powerful stopgaps in preventing the spread of this type of content? And these are really bite-sized pieces to take on when you're having conversations. But I also wouldn't do it in a way that is at all patronizing, because I think that young people and teenagers see right through that. And, you know, in many ways, teenagers are the best positioned to be able to implement quickly the recommendations that we provide in our media literacy toolkit. They are incredibly adept. They have perhaps the highest digital intelligence of anyone. I try as I may, and yet sometimes I am still a little bit of a Luddite. And so I would say that having conversations with teenagers might also benefit from leveraging what their skill sets are. Because when we give tools to teenagers, part of what we've seen, colleagues ranging from a number of partners, Namely has an amazing program on this, MediaWise has a program from Pointer training first-time voters through very short text-based classes, is that they can really digest and take that in to implement quickly. So in no way should you be afraid of those conversations. And the same way that we have put together the kinds of suggestions around how to talk to friends and family that share misinformation, you may want to think through how you can apply those recommendations when you have conversations with teenagers. Another person has asked, in the realm of young people, I am an academic librarian and concerned about students at my university falling victim to disinformation. What's the best way to engage university students in conversations about this problem? And I would just say that everything I said prior about teenagers, I would also add that young people, students in the university setting, those are equally types of stakeholders, voters even that are first-time voters, that you want to not talk down to them, not be patronizing, that you want to find ways to make it personal, talk about your own experiences and how you have come to care about disinformation and why it's such an urgent threat right now. Is there a way to go back and remove your comments once you realize that the information is disinformation, which adjusts the algorithms for that post? Well, one, you can always go back and remove your comments if you have posted on someone else's account. But once you post, the algorithms have shifted and the engagement and sort of their internal backdoor way that they are amplifying content will have changed. And so for purposes of adjusting the algorithms, deleting your post may prevent, of course, future people seeing it, but it will not then suddenly have changed that for the period of time after you posted when it was public, a lot of the engagement around that post will absolutely have been boosted, I would say even juiced, so that other people see more. Someone else, and this is the last question I will answer, I know there were a number of others, let's see, you mentioned that emotional engagement as a foundation for people to be pulled into dis and misinformation. Is there a way to frame the act of correcting against dis and misinformation in a way that is just as emotionally engaging and motivating? If this perspective can't be achieved, I worry that people's motivations won't be guided naturally to this necessary behavior. Excellent question. I highly encourage you to check out our new guide that we put together on how to talk with friends and family, because I think that you definitely need to be as emotionally engaged and thoughtful and frankly empathetic in how you talk with people when you do want to correct them. And so framing how you address someone is really critical. The worst thing you can do from a human perspective is say, you're wrong, why would you post this? In all caps would be even worse. And so if you want to try to engage someone, I still think that sending a private message is usually the best idea, and that you want to be able to be really personable about it, that you want to show someone that you went about doing some homework, maybe that you also have fallen prey to sharing things and we all need to be corrected, that all of us are in this together. And a kind of solidarity where you're sharing personal anecdotes can maybe help avoid, and I often think it can help avoid in what I have seen, it can avoid people clamming up And actually, it's worth noting that there really isn't research that if you are correcting someone in that way, that they will dig deeply into their beliefs. Some people will, but that is not a human tendency that we can say absolutely exists every time. And so when you frame how you correct someone's posts, just again, do so in ways where you bring a kind of kindness and empathy to it, because we are all on an ongoing path. The train is moving in the media literacy world, and each of us is becoming a little bit better all the time, every single day, at implementing practices that make sure we're better at discerning what we see. So when you call someone out, think of it as a learning opportunity for them. You could potentially be the difference between them thinking more critically next time or not. And if you bring about the comments in a way that allows them to talk through this with you, you can share your own process. And maybe, just maybe, that will be the door that opens up for them to think more critically, to then implement some of the practices you mentioned. Maybe their first step will simply be thinking through, why do I feel emotional when I see posts? Or if I can't verify something, I will not share it. That could be a really great pledge that you guys make together and in your communities. So with that, I would like to wrap up. And as a reminder, when you leave this session, you will be prompted with a post-workshop survey. I hope you'll fill it out. It is anonymous. We're not publicizing it. We really just love it for our own purposes. And we are going to be doing more and more of these with a variety of tactics and information and examples of election disinformation. So stay tuned for more from us. I want to give a final shout out and a round of applause, if all of you join me in a round of applause, for our wonderful partners. Jesse, Common Cause, thank you so much for joining us. And then the Georgia Alliance for Social Justice and our library partners. That includes the Boston and Jersey City Public Libraries. So finally, just one silent round of applause for everyone. And I really hope that we'll see you again. All of us need to reinforce these practices. Thank you so much.